Today's academic sessions begin with a plenary session. Let me usher Dr. Damayanti Piris and Dr. Nuraj Joseph, consultant clinical oncologists, on stage to commence the day's proceeding.
Very good morning to all of you. And for the keynote plenary of this virtual conference, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Saroj Jayasinghe, who is the professor in the Department of Clinical Medicine, Faculty of Medicine, Colombo, Sri Lanka. He is an honorary consultant physician to the National Hospital of Sri Lanka, Colombo. He is an alumnus of the faculty and joined the staff as a lecturer in 1980. And he has MBBS honors, MD Colombo, MD Bristol, FCCP and FRCP UK. He was the founder director of the Medical Education Development and Research Center. His research interests include innovations in clinical teaching, health equity, social determinants of health, and application of complexity science to clinical medicine and population health. He currently heads the Department of Clinical Medicine, University of Colombo, and co-organizes an interdisciplinary postgraduate diploma course in health development of the university. His topic today would be medical humanities.
Good morning, a warm welcome to you. Thank you, Dr. Kanti Pereira and the Council for inviting me to deliver this presentation at a plenary session. My topic is on medical humanities, and I have included a picture from the masks used in the healing processes of Sri Lanka, just to highlight the fact that the humanities have played a very important role in Sri Lankan traditional health systems. Since medical humanities is a relatively new subject area, I thought I will anchor my lecture on a hypothetical case to bring out certain issues. And the issue I have chosen is the decline in empathy we see in some of our professionals. I will also explore the reasons for such a decline and how medical humanities could be used to counter this decline. Finally, I will outline some of the work which we have done in the Department of Medical Humanities. So let us begin by trying to imagine ourselves as children in this surroundings and environment, not an uncommon sight in urban areas, especially in the urban areas in and around Colombo. So imagine a child coming out of this environment and arriving in the hospital late at night, and the scenario builds from this situation. Now the scenario shifts to the hospital, and a girl from this environment is rushed to hospital by an anxious mother, a single mother who is looking after this child while working during daytime in a garment factory. And due to lack of leave, she couldn't bring the child before. The doctors are seeing the child, and since the mother is quite anxious, she asks them as to the child's condition. Now, since the doctors are conversing in English, this young mother is not able to understand. And the immediate reply, in Sinhala of course, by the doctor is, "Why did you delay in bringing this child? She may not have survived." At which stage the mother begins to sob and cry. Now, this sort of situation, not uncommon, highlights certain issues that we as a profession should face. Firstly, there is a lack of empathy or compassion in those two doctors. So they really did not feel for the anxieties which the mother was having. They were not aware of the fact that she was coming from a poor background and her inability to bring the child before. They did not appreciate her anxieties and her love for her child. And when they retorted, they did so in a manner which shows very poor communication skills and also insensitivity, especially in our Sri Lankan culture, which values motherhood and looking after children as an important part of family life. And the doctors, by their statement, have in fact attacked this very value which is dear to a lot of parents. So out of these three aspects, I would like to pick out the lack of empathy as a crucial challenge facing the medical profession in Sri Lanka. So what is the situation in Sri Lanka? We have embarked on a study to explore this further, but let us use our own observations and compare ourselves with the data which is available from other countries. So if we draw a graph on the degree of empathy or compassion or feeling for others on the vertical axis, and look at the behavior of cohorts of students over the years, what's the sort of relationship we would get? The impression we get is that students, as they go through medical school, steadily become less empathic or less humane, as shown in the downward trend in this graph. This seems to commence after they begin their clinical work, somewhere in the third year. However, once they go overseas, they seem to conform to the values and behaviors associated with empathy in those countries. And we get very few reports or complaints from our overseas trainers. In fact, they almost always commend the Sri Lankan trainees for their hard work, their knowledge, their skills, and positive attitude. What happens to the overseas trainees who return from their training? The impression is that most of them continue to be caring specialists, but quite a few do end up as bad eggs. It is the latter group that gets prominence in the media, and the next slide illustrates two such examples. I'll allow you 30 seconds to read through. These are real stories from the web. In a sense, we are not alone in making such observations. Studies from other countries have shown a steady decline in empathy after the third year of medical school. Most of these studies have used the Jefferson Empathy Scale or similar scales to assess empathy of students as they progress in medical school. It seems that the medical curriculum or the environment we are exposing students in some way affect their ingrained empathy or compassionate behaviors. What could be the reason for such a decline in empathy? What is happening to our students? What is happening to the doctors? How is it that they are ending up to be less humane? We don't have studies from Sri Lanka, so we have to rely on studies done elsewhere. And this is a results of a systematic review which looked at the decline in empathy and its reasons in studies on medical students as well as residents. Some of these were longitudinal studies and some of these were cross-sectional studies. All in all, they showed a decline in empathy, and the reasons seem to vary. The next slide shows you some of the reasons identified from this systematic review. Please read through and reflect on your own experiences as a medical student, an intern, and as a trainee, and even as a consultant. How, when we came into the profession, the idealism we had, and how it clashed with real life or the realities. Episodes where we were mistreated by senior colleagues, the lack of social support, which makes us vulnerable, the excess workload, which causes burnout, short stay of patients in the hospital, which prevents us from coming to know them as human beings. We just see their cross-section. And the relative lack of good role models who were coping with empathy, who were coping with empathic distress, but continue to be empathic. And this is a painting I did quite some time ago, which you may interpret as empathic distress. So we appear to be very professional, while inside we do suffer, especially about our dying patients. Let us look at the neurophysiological basis of empathy and empathic distress. The basis of empathy is due to mirror neurons. These are neurons that fire both when the animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by someone else. So the neuron mirrors the behavior of others as if the observer were itself acting. And these have been identified in the brains of humans, primate species, as well as in birds. Observing distress of others also causes certain areas of the brain to get activated, such as the anterior insular cortex and the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. So if I were to describe what happened to me when I failed in that resuscitation, I had a clinical response and I had an emotional response. And the emotional response was partly due to my observing the distress of others. It was an empathic distress which I had. And the emotional component was that I had empathy, and because the patient died, I could feel for the relatives of the patient, the children of the patient. I had a father of that same age, and I was distressed, and therefore I almost cried. Now the problem with this is we don't go back home after the first death, never to face a similar situation. Over the years, I would have had to face hundreds, if not thousands of instances where patients died or patients came with incurable illnesses which I had diagnosed, or they were dying despite our treatment, having to console parents, having to console children, having to console friends, and sometimes having to console your loved ones. So this repeated empathic distress leads to several possible responses. Either we avoid it, or we develop our barriers and become insensitive to distress of others, or we reflexly react as the two doctors did when the mother brought her child at 11:30 in the night, or some of them really burn out, become depressed, and need supportive mental health counseling and care. So repeated bouts of distress, which we observe from the time of the third year and going on during the final year, seeing that patients are dying, they are crying, relatives are crying, you are feeling hurt, and you are supposed to cope with this. And this ultimately has a toll on your psyche, the way you respond. And graphically, I have shown the situation. So you have a clinical encounter, you have certain emotions, these emotions in repeated episodes lead to repeated distress, and then you become benumbed and you start avoiding, you become insensitive. Worst is when you start to react and hurt the person who is showing some distress. So how do we counter a decline in empathy? What are the methods we have? What can we do in the curriculum which will counter this decline? Firstly, we could teach them how to cope. So important part of coping is to become aware of your own emotions, your self-awareness, and that's where mindfulness and mindfulness training helps. And when you feel anxious or distressed, you try to counter this response by simple techniques like deep breathing. You try to share your distress with the rest of the team, and when you start to share such experiences, it helps you to get your distress levels down. Or we try to switch from distress and not doing anything to the compassion mode. That is, to try and become more compassionate and thereby avoid empathic distress. So in other words, you're trying to switch the way you respond. In compassion, the difference between compassion and empathy, it's a hotly debated topic, but for the purposes of this lecture, compassion is where you don't allow yourself just to go into the distress mode, but you try the very best to help that person. So your helping mode of helping another person in distress, trying to do the maximum you can, rather than getting entangled in your own emotions of distress. So the idea is to see if you can promote that sort of behavior. So this slide summarizes the ways we can address empathic distress. And we feel that promoting compassion, the emotions related to compassion, and the behaviors related to compassion is one approach we could take to help the profession. So how do you cultivate compassion? This has become an area of interest to several researchers, and institutions such as Stanford have got courses on cultivating compassion, and the literature suggests several methods we can adopt. One is to be compassionate towards oneself, not to be hard on one's own self. So I should not be blaming myself if the person failed to be resuscitated. I have to console myself. Then there are methods of compassionate mind training, where you go through exercises of showing compassion, and one such practice is meditation. And here we have, in Sri Lanka, we have forms of Buddhist meditation, such as Maitri Bhavanava, which cultivate compassion according to studies which have been published in the literature. And we can have secular forms of meditation which will cultivate compassion, as seen in as done in Stanford. We can use the arts, so music, art, poetry, and so on, to give the humane perspective of illness, of suffering, of happiness, so that our profession, our students become more sensitive of the minds of other people who are undergoing various problems. And we can use narrative-based learning, another method where you use stories of people, like the story of the mother who brought the child at 11:30. If the doctors knew that story, that she was a single mother living in that urban area, working every day, and therefore didn't have a way of bringing the child earlier, and didn't have money for her tuk-tuk, and then had to rely on someone else's help to come at 11:30 in the night. She did that not because she wanted her child to die, but that was her circumstances. So if the doctors knew that narration, that story, they would react in a different way. I have summarized some of these in an article which was published in the Ceylon Journal of Medical Sciences. It's available in the web. And this is, by the way, a journal of the Faculty of Medicine, Colombo. So you are invited to read this and publish papers. So in summary, how do we cultivate compassion? We should be compassionate towards oneself. We can try compassionate mind training, meditation practices, and the arts and narrative-based learning. So in a graphic form, this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to reduce the distress by making people, giving them the tools to cope, such as mindfulness to recognize, maybe debriefing, and so on, to cope with the distress, and also trying to improve their compassion response. And with time, literature suggests that during the clinical encounter, And when these emotions do arise, with compassion training, you're shunting your emotions towards a compassionate response rather than a distress. And this leads to patients who are more satisfied and less burnout in the doctors, and several such advantages. Interestingly, there is evidence from neurophysiological studies. Basically, if you look at the blue and the red dots, you find that compassion causes increased activity of a certain part of the brain, which is slightly different from the empathy, the area which is triggered with empathy. So in other words, it seems to suggest that when you're faced with a distressing situation, you could either go down the empathy pathway with distress, or you could go to a compassionate pathway with where you respond in trying to help the person. And this is something you can develop with time, with neuroplasticity. Repetitive metta meditators seem to have different functional MRIs, and there seems to be a neurophysiological basis for this whole process. This slide summarizes the approach we are trying to take. So we are trying to reduce the emotional distress, and the other pathway which we noticed in the case study, and hopefully promote a more compassionate response. So instead of responding in the manner the intern did, perhaps the better response would have been to speak to her, explain to her, understand her plight, and never to use harsh words which accused her of delaying hospitalization of a child. So the approach we are proposing is to use narrative-based learning, the arts, understanding the emotions of others, the EQ part of our mind, mindfulness training, and compassion training. The latter two are not there in the curriculum in a formal way. But I know Javadanapura is hoping to introduce mindfulness in a big way. What is narrative-based learning? We get the students, which you can do even with your postgraduates, is to ask them to speak to the patient, not in the mode of taking a history, but as a narration, as a story from childhood. What happened in childhood? What was the area they grew up in? Which school did they go to? How was school? How were your relationships with your friends? And what did you do as an adult? What are the jobs you did? So you're trying to build a story, a narration. We want them to write a short story about the patient or a novel about the patient. So first year or second year students go to the hospital and speak to a patient in groups, and then they listen to their story and come and narrate it to the rest of the group, and they reflect on it, and we try to see their emotional response, we try to understand their emotional response, show them why they are feeling in this manner, and describe how they can develop a more compassionate response. Now, this can be done with assignments where you send the students, or you can use literature. And there are several studies which have shown where literature is a useful way of doing of narrative-based learning. So you give a literary text and ask them to read it, understand it, translate it sometimes, which helps in understanding, then try to see how they can learn the feelings of others through the text they are reading. There is research to show the positive impact of the arts on empathy and compassion. So we have studies that have shown listening to music, art appreciation, poetry, literature, and so on improve the empathy of students in the healthcare professional courses. So we have lectures on the illness from the perspective of humanities, which brings out appreciation of the arts and trying to bring out the emotional aspects of the artist or the subject. And then there are several other informal lectures which we have to encourage the appreciation of the arts by our students. Emotional intelligence is also helpful to understand the emotions of others and to empathize with others. And we do have at least one lecture on the topic to promote emotional intelligence in our students and to make them aware of this aspect. Mindfulness is another method which we could use to improve the empathic response. And there is a lot of data now coming from neurophysiological studies and psychometric studies showing that mindfulness over a prolonged period through neuronal plasticity actually rewires your brain and you become a different person in a sense. You have the ability, the potential to change the way you think, the way you react to situations, the way your emotions arise. Compassion training courses are available around the world. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka is yet to start on such a course, but this is a leaflet from Stanford, and you can see the interest they are taking in promoting compassion and techniques such as meditation, metta, visualization, breathing exercises, and so on to improve compassion in academics as well as in professionals. This slide summarizes what we are trying to do. So we are hoping that narratives, the arts, lectures on EQ, mindfulness training, and so on would change the way the doctors or the students would behave, the way they would tackle emotional distress or emotions during the clinical encounter. And we hope that the sort of hypothetical case which I described to you would have a totally different outcome. Going back to our case, what we would expect is a better response by the doctors, and an example is given here. I will give you a few minutes to read. In the next few minutes, I hope to discuss the developments of medical humanities in the Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. As you know, this is the first such department in Sri Lanka and maybe even in South Asia. One could trace the origins of medical humanities department to activities which have happened over several decades. In the 1970s, under the influence of legends like Professor Carlo Fonseca, we were able to start the first art society in the faculty, and our batch played a crucial role in this process. And we had festivals of art, plays, and so on, which has now evolved to an annual festival called Ninnada, which is very, very professional. Subsequently, the next stage was when it was formalized, the introduction of behavioral sciences with the new curriculum. And the pioneer in this initiative was Professor Nalaka Mendis, the Professor Emeritus in Psychiatry. Since then, we have tried to improve the teaching programs of the behavioral sciences stream, which focused primarily on communication skills, personal development, resolving ethical issues, professionalism, and so on. And during the workshops which we conducted to improve the BSS, the idea that we should introduce medical humanities was proposed. The Department of Medical Humanities was formally established in August 2016, and I must mention the role played by the then Dean, Professor Jennifer Pereira, to facilitate this process of establishing a new department. Subsequent to its establishment and my being appointed as the founder, head of the department, we held a whole series of lecture discussions, and the list is given here, in order to develop our ideas around this field called medical humanities. It culminated in July of 2018 when we held the first international conference on medical humanities in the faculty. This was a historic event, probably one of the first international medical humanities conferences in the world. We had registrants approaching 125. We had about 34 resource persons from 6 different countries. The topics we discussed were related to medical humanities and the curriculum of our faculty. Following this international conference, we conducted several other lecture discussion sessions and then had a special session on medical humanities during the 150th year anniversary Colombo Medical Congress, which was held from the 12th to the 15th of February. And again, the emphasis on the role of the arts in medical education is shown by the composition and the titles of the topics which you see in this slide. We have proceeded to spread the word of medical humanities to other parts of the region, and our first stop is Bhutan, and we have already held 2 workshops in Bhutan on medical humanities, and they were very well received, and they may include a module on medical humanities in their postgraduate training. This slide summarizes the presentation, and I give you a few seconds to read through. Let me end by thanking the college once again and to all of you for giving me a patient hearing. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you, Professor Jayasinghe, for that very informative lecture on a topic which is of direct relevance to oncology. We have two questions from the audience. One relates to a situation where in potentially curative cancers, patients seeking native treatment and the distress faced by oncologists and managing that situation with empathy and compassion, knowing that you had a situation which was potentially curative and now the patient has opted for a different modality of treatment and the cancer becoming incurable because of that. So how could oncologists cope with that situation with empathy and compassion?
Thank you. So there is no short answer to that question. It's a case of convincing the patients as well as the relatives on how important it is to continue with the treatment. And if as a team, sometimes you might have to meet with two or three. When two or three doctors or nurses, whether with the doctor speaks, sometimes they get convinced. You might have to have two or three meetings with them in the clinic also. First week they might say they want to opt for alternative form, and next time when they come you try again. So it's a process, and if you have done your very best to help, you have to be compassionate towards yourself. I mean, you cannot help it. You have done your maximum. So I think there is no formula other than trying to understand why they are saying so, explaining to them why you are saying so. Sometimes there are models of thinking of an illness is different. When they talk of surgery, they invariably their vision is one of of extensive incisions. It might be just a small incision. You have to say that you have to explain the procedure, and so we have found that most procedures we do get the message across. So I hope I have answered that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question relates to actually breaking bad news, where sometimes we have to make the decision of not to resuscitate a patient. And again, that's a very difficult situation, and we have to explain to families. And so again, the question is, how do we cope with the stress and how do we handle this situation in a more empathic and compassionate way?
Thank you. Once again, there are two ways of, I think, looking at this. Now, in our culture, what invariably happens is we as doctors and the team, we decide when to stop the resuscitation. We don't engage much with the relatives or with the patient. And then we are having a situation of trying to get the relatives or even the patient to agree. Whereas what should ideally happen is, where in that whole process, when the person is falling ill or becoming more and more serious, when the relatives also realize if they are engaged with you, then the decision becomes a common decision and they agree. And there are ways of communicating it, especially to the relatives, where if you say that, trying to resuscitate a person who is in this situation will actually cause a lot of suffering to that person, because you are just trying to resuscitate and you're trying to take this person into the intensive care and put them on a machine. So if you explain this procedure, it does, you're able to move the decision. And again, you find that the relatives are not, they're frightened to make that decision because they'll be blamed by other relatives, in which case you might have to meet the other relatives and you have to say, I'm prepared to speak to the others and try to convince them. Now, I know in a very busy oncology clinic, this is difficult. This is almost impossible, but certainly we have to try, we have to get our juniors to engage in such situations. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And on behalf of the Sri Lanka College of Oncologists, I wish to extend profound gratitude to Professor Saroj Jayasinghe for delivering the keynote address and setting the stage for our annual academic sessions. We look forward to working with you in the area of medical humanities and extending some of you, and hope you would extend your pioneering work to our postgraduate training program as well. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, most certainly.